Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Don't Praise the Machine. And today, the cultural apocalypse might have just claimed its biggest, loudest, and most expensive Australian legacy media victims yet. After 25 years of ruling the airwaves like a pair of obscene and indecent gods, the unthinkable has happened. The $200 million dream might be dead. Last week, the marbled pillars of the Australian commercial radio Parthenon collapsed when Jackie O walked away from Kyle Sandilands, saying she cannot continue to work with him. We're talking about the termination of a decades-long partnership that was supposed to run until 2034. It's a messy divorce involving on-air spats about astrology, serious misconduct allegations, and a failed Melbourne expansion that's been bleeding ratings. Today, we're performing a post-mortem on commercial radio. We're looking at the eye-watering hubris of those contracts, the history of a duo that survived every scandal except each other, and what happens to a medium when its biggest stars finally burn out. But I can't sift through the wreckage of these frequency-modulated waves alone. I'm gonna need a man who understands the transactional nature of human relationships and the dark arts of commercializing attention at all costs. He's currently speaking to me on a $50 secondhand Shure SM58 microphone, bedazzled with glue and donut sprinkles. He is the #1 tenured professor of podcasting. It's got to be the one called John Serious Misconduct. Maloney John, the crown has been pawned, the king is shouting at ghosts in an empty studio, and the queen has officially abdicated the airwaves. Tell me, John, as the static settles, how heavy is your radio heart this morning as you stare blankly at the latest Nielsen ratings from our fallen heroes?
Pretty bad. It's pretty bad vibes down here in Melbourne now. You might think I'm in a dressing gown with ruffled hair because I've been up all night with a sick baby, but you'd be wrong. The reason is that I am grieving for the loss of my favourite radio show, and I can't bear the thought of getting in the car to commute to work without their trademark antics in my ears. So I've just quit, and I'm just trying to pick up the pieces, trying to basically listen to reruns of Kyle and Jackie O and trying to find a way through all this mess. And it's a fascinating time here in Australia because you and I finished school the same year that Kyle and Jackie O got together as a team.
Yeah.
And so that gives you a sense of the kind of generational shift that this represents. And a lot of people are asking, is this indicative of a broader decline of commercial radio in Australia, perhaps internationally? It's part of a trend. People are moving to other formats. Or will there be just another Kyle and Jackie O to carry on the legacy? So for those who don't know, I might just take you through because, some of our listeners will have had the pleasure of never having listened to Kyle and Jackie O. Just to be clear, they're pretty awful. And I was being ironic when I said I was grieving them. I'm quite happy to hear about their misfortune. And so one of the things you'll hear from me in the next 45 minutes is a fair bit of Schadenfreude. But so basically, yeah, Kyle and Jackie O got together in 2000. Kyle had sort of come up in radio in Brisbane and worked in kind of, in the way that a lot of people do as a sort of probably an intern and then a producer and a promotional assistant and whatever, and eventually got on the air. And he was kind of known pretty early on for his irreverent, slightly kind of freewheeling, offensive kind of rascally style. And Jackie was quite different. She's known as a more sort of restrained, empathetic, sort of friendly persona. And so perhaps it was for that reason that the gods of radio decided in 2000, let's put these two somewhat contrasting personalities together and see what happens. And they got together at a 2-day FM in Sydney, and it worked really well. They had some early successes in the 2000s. They became, kind of known as a drive time radio team. Yeah. And they, did the usual things that I'll come back to. There's a bit of a kind of well-worn tradition in Australian radio of the sort of methods and patter of commercial radio, but they did celebrity interviews, they did kind of on-air stunts, they did listener phone calls, they did competitions, they did sort of controversial segments about relationships and sex and taboo topics and whatever. And they basically have kept in that vein for their subsequent career. They moved to a station called KIIS FM in 2014, and the Australian Radio Network rebranded that station at that time. So it was a new station, and they basically were the kind of headhunted, big talent for that station. So that's when they became, they went from kind of big to very big, I guess, in the Australian radio world, and they became the number one morning show in Sydney. In 2023, they signed a $200 million contract. So with the Australian Radio Network, or ARN, and they became, as I said, this kind of flagship talent for their network, which then expanded to Melbourne. So previously they'd been on the radio in Sydney, they'd been number one in Sydney, and then they were expanded to KIIS in Melbourne, replacing a previous local team. That turned out to be a bit of a flawed gamble. So people in Melbourne are just a bit smarter and more genteel than people in Sydney, and they didn't. I think one of the ways I heard it described was that kind of people in Sydney had kind of just, the sort of boiled frog analogy. They'd just gotten used to, a sort of steady stream of controversies coming from Kyle and Jackie O, and their sort of slightly offensive, edgy banter, and trying to push the envelope. And so they didn't really care. They didn't really cause a fuss. And when they moved to Melbourne, I think it did cause a fuss because people were like, "What is this crap? I'm trying to drive my kids to school, and suddenly, they're talking about foreskins or something." And so there was a huge, number of complaints. People switched off from KIIS FM in droves. They were much less popular than the team they'd replaced, and KIIS FM in Melbourne slipped down the ratings. And so the station, I think, was kind of the station owners were getting sort of slightly anxious, having locked themselves into this 10-year, $200 million contract. And so, but as luck would have it, the show, well, perhaps not, maybe it's a conspiracy, but as luck would have it, the show imploded in recent weeks. And it was kind of not the first time this sort of thing had happened. Kyle and Jackie O had on-air spats before. They'd had the regulator step in because they'd gone too far with some stunty skit. But so initially a lot of people were like, well, this is just another attention-grabbing kind of fake fight. But it seems not to have been. So basically what happened was they were interviewing, they had a guest on, and who I think was a kind of regular, and they were talking about Prince Andrew, former Prince Andrew, and Jackie was talking about his astrology chart and what it revealed, and Kyle just kicked off about how she's so obsessed with astrology and it's ruining her work. And then that kind of broadened into, there'd obviously been kind of simmering tensions between them over a few months. So they had this kind of, what in any other station would be a pretty remarkable sort of on-air spat where they were, Kyle was saying, this isn't just me. Everyone in the station is talking about how you've lost the plot, you've lost your focus, you're not professional, and you're obsessed with these fucking astrology charts and blah, blah, blah. And she got quite emotional on air and said, well, if you don't like me, just, find someone else and blah, blah, blah. And then she was initially on a station break. So Kyle was still sort of, I think, presenting the show solo and said, I've sent her a message. She's gotten back to me. It's all going to be fine. And after a couple of weeks, she told the station, I'm not prepared to work with Kyle anymore. And he was suspended for a time for misconduct, for having kind of harangued her on air. And now I think they're trying to figure out, well, what happens next. No doubt apparently Jackie's lawyered up. Sadly, I didn't get a call. And they're going to have a big spat about this, what happens with this kind of $200 million contract, no doubt. But it's a kind of interesting time to reflect on how Australian radio got to this position where people who were, people who would not be known overseas were earning salaries comparable to someone like Ryan Seacrest, perhaps not comparable to someone like Howard Stern, but he's one of the few people internationally who would be out earning Kyle and Jackie O. So why are Australian radio DJs getting paid so much? Why have we kind of gotten into this pattern of having sort of garish and offensive FM station presenters? And what happens from here? Is the kind of days of personality-driven, titans of radio, are those days coming to an end, or is this just a bump in the road?
Yeah, fascinating, John. I have been proliferally aware of them, having been out of the country for 15 years. They dominate Australian media, and, if you ever happen to accidentally be on the Australian area of the Daily Mail website or, God help you, news.com.au, their faces would definitely pop up a lot. I happened to catch a Kyle Sandilands like Cribs-esque episode some years ago that I sent you, because I was just like, I couldn't have written this. I couldn't have written a man as dreadful as this. As Kyle Sandilands took a camera crew through a sort of garish home with his like young fake boobed bottle blonde partner or wife, and like I think her dad was like kind of living with them because she just sort of brought a cadre of hangers on to like hang out. Just one of those people who's just like,
he's probably younger than Kyle.
This Kyle's mate.
Yeah.
And he was just going, oh, here's my gold car, and here's my wife, and here's her dad, and here's her brother, and we're all just like chilling on the deck, and it just and I was like, I can't believe this is real.
I know. And the house was kind of like if the sort of obnoxious kid in your year 7 class had been able to design his house. Basically. It just looked disgusting.
And I remember, John, you mentioned that they got together in 2000. Jackie O's radio career started in Adelaide, would you believe? And I remember in the mid 90s, she was on a show on Triple M in Adelaide that me and my friends used to listen to religiously, and she was with her then boyfriend / she became her husband, a guy called Ugly Phil. Ugly Phil. And I remember distinctly, I hadn't read this for years, I hadn't seen this for years, but she first got on the show doing the phones, and so people would call in and she would man the phones and do a bit of on-air stuff when she was on the phones, and she was called Jackie the Phone Tart, and I had not thought of that or read it since the mid-90s when I remembered, I used to listen to that radio show with Jackie the Phone Tart, and then I was reading articles about her start in radio this week, and I was like, fucking hell, that's right. And then she had jettisoned that nickname by the time she got to Kyle Sandilands, because she was basically tapped as like a crazy radio talent, for her style. And Jackie O comes from the fact that she married Ugly Phil, and I think his surname was O'Neill. She became Jackie as in O'Neill.
Okay.
Yeah.
And not so because of her resemblance to JFK's widow.
because of her grace and poise.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, but we can also, you mentioned also the economics of this are fascinating. So maybe we can get into those a little bit, John. So as you were saying, I'll let you explain a little bit. Yeah, $200 million contract over 10 years for a duo. So it breaks down to $10 million a year each for 10 years.
Exactly. So, and that's kind of, so I had a look at, what people are getting comparatively. And as I said, someone like Ryan Seacrest, who we would know, I mean, I've never really listened to him, but I'm aware of who he is. He's kind of in that stratosphere as well. I think, Howard Stern's kind of in a class of his own. And then there's a whole bunch of people who would be quite successful, who might be kind of, major city-based radio network DJs in America, who are just not getting that kind of money. They might be getting hundreds of thousands or even millions a year, but not $10 million each locked in over 10 years. That's a crazy amount of money. So what's driving that? Well, there's a couple of things that I found out in researching, in trying to answer that question. One is obviously Australia has a kind of a geographical oddity that I guess means that we have, a concentrated we have concentrated population centres, and hand in hand with that, we have a kind of concentrated market for radio. So, you contrast it with somewhere like the US, where the population is much larger, but much more evenly spread across the kind of landscape. And you tend to get this sort of fragmentation of different sort of radio fiefdoms in different regions, different states, whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas in none of them holds that much concentrated advertising heft or listenership power. Whereas if you corner the sort of Sydney-based radio market, well, you've already kind of nailed over a quarter of Australia's population. Then if you come down to Melbourne and you've got the sort of eastern seaboard under your thumb, then you're sort of pretty much home and hose. You've got more than well over half of Australia's population listening to you. And as well as that, the kind of, well, I guess hand in hand with that, the sort of way of the corporate conglomeration of Australian radio companies is much more concentrated. So I mentioned the Australian Radio Network, there's a couple of others, but there's not, as there would be again in somewhere like the US, this kind of vast array of different little companies. There's a few big hitters. And so, when it comes to kind of deals and buying power and advertising, who the advertisers are dealing with, it's much more of a sort of closed shop. So that's one thing. The other thing is just geographically that, the cities are set up to, we're kind of a driving country still. A lot of people commute to work in their car. They're sitting in traffic in Sydney or in Melbourne. Those commutes are often quite long. The cities are very kind of 20th century style cities in that you've got a sort of central business district surrounded by sprawling suburbs. And so you might be driving in from the suburbs for 45 minutes or an hour or whatever, and you've got just enough time to kind of listen to a commercial radio show. You're leaving at the same time each day. So your kind of habits are pretty settled. And, it sort of lends itself to this kind of entertainment. And of course, for an advertiser, that means you've got sort of a guaranteed, legion of bums on car seats in your pocket if you can get your advertising on one of these shows. And so that's also part of it. And advertisers will tend to be risk averse. So, if they can afford to, they'll say, if you're a kind of big company in Australia, you'll say, well, I just want to go with the number one show. I'm not going to bother I'm going to look at the ratings. I'm going to see who's at the top. I'm going to get my company advertised on that show. So there's a big fall off. There's a lot of air between number one and number two in terms of the amount of advertising revenue they can generate. And of course, what that means is it sort of tends to widen over time because the big advertisers funnel money into number one. That number one becomes even bigger. It kind of is able to market itself more aggressively. It's able to appeal more to, even bigger advertisers. And so it just sort of snowballs to the point where there's a kind of what I've heard referred to as a kind of winner take most market. So the number one show really tends to over time become more and more dominant, and it can generate, the morning radio slot is I think the most valuable advertising slot in the daily life of Australia, which makes sense because, you're comparing it to what newspapers and television, which is sort of, kind of farts in the wind compared to millions of people sitting in their cars being advertised to on a radio station.
The other thing I read about that made perfect sense to me, John, is you have people driving to work. What is unique about people driving to work? They work. What do people who work have? Money. So you basically have a whole population of people who are going to earn money, who are trapped in their car for, 30, 45 minutes. And what I also read is that, and maybe we'll come to this, is that people realize that commercial FM radio's days are probably numbered. However, still at this moment, some of our generation and Generation X and Boomers are still absolutely loving radio, and so they are tuning in the morning on their commute. And again, what do people between the ages of 30 and 55 have? Money.
Yeah, disposable incomes. That's right. Yeah, and it amazes me, and we can come to this, but the only time I really listen to commercial radio is when I'm stuck in an Uber, and often I will. And I have more than once, I've said to that, if Kyle and Jackie O's on, I'll say, can you please turn that off? Because it really, if I'm going into work, I just don't need the extra stress of having to listen to them. But it amazes me that they'll say, okay, 1-800-KYLE, call us in or whatever. And people will just be, the phone lines will just be lit up. And I'll think, who is calling a radio station in 2026? But they do. So the other thing I guess is you've got, I contrasted it with America, but it's also worth contrasting with the UK, where you've got a public broadcaster, the BBC, which is sort of fragmented into a bunch of sub networks. And really, has a lot of market share in terms of people's listening to the radio, and just operates differently because it's a public broadcaster. Whereas Australia is a sort of version of an American, FM heavy market, but one that's much more concentrated, and so drives up the salaries of a small stable of presenters. And these shows are really kind of personality driven. So some people like Kyle and Jackie O can demand a lot of money because without them, KIIS FM is just indistinguishable from anything else. Like they've all got access to a similar catalogue of songs. Yeah. So, you're not really listening for the music, especially now, because you can just sort of do that. You could just, put in Spotify and listen to it in your car. You're listening to it because of what's going to happen on the show, because of their personalities. So they can say to the station, hey, you're generating, 50, 60, 70 million bucks in advertising revenue every year. That's mostly down to us too. So, giving us 10 million of that doesn't sound like that much actually. And I think for the radio stations, locking them into sort of 10-year contracts is actually probably advantageous. Kyle and Jackie O defected to KIIS FM from 2Day FM, and that was quite a big thing at the time. And obviously the radio stations are keen not to, lose their number one spot. So they will require their talent to kind of lock into these contracts if they can, to sort of make sure that they're safe, basically. And as added to that, I guess you've got this kind of sort of cultural trend, which goes all the way back to sort of people in the 80s, where Australian radio sort of, I guess, was taking its cue from America, and we went down the path of having these sort of controversial shock jocks and these shows which were very much driven by the personality of the person presenting rather than the content. So you had, for Australian people listening, these will be familiar names, people like John Laws and Alan Jones. Yeah. And they're basically like, they're just notorious assholes. Like they're just terrible people to deal with. And everyone who works with them says they're just awful. And Alan Jones is actually in trouble for a string of predatory sexual assaults or indecent assaults on younger men who worked at the radio station. That's the kind of person that you're dealing with, these sort of people who are just sort of power abusing schmucks. But that translates to kind of an edgy, interesting on air personality, because they'll just say what they think. They'll have a crack at people. They'll, they'll take calls from, and then they have to kind of, because they've got so many bums on seats, people who are, wanting to get their name across, who might be musicians, might be political figures, are going on these shows, which of course just kind of self-perpetuates the kind of gravity that they have as sort of tent poles of popular culture. So that's kind of why you get this, it starts to make sense that they get these kind of extraterrestrial salaries. And of course now there is a kind of, there is a slow fragmentation. People are listening to podcasts and streaming services and whatever in the car. I certainly would be doing that. But I guess, there's kind of a There's still enough heft in those models for them to attract those kinds of people. Although, the statistics do show, even in the last 10 years, there's been a pretty significant decline in the number of commuters who are listening to commercial radio stations. That's the kind of nutshell of the economics of it. And I guess, the downside is that you and I and everyone else has to have their airwaves and occasionally their news cycles dominated by these dickheads. I mean, it's kind of interesting because they walk a really tight line. On the one hand, controversy generates a rating spike, or it generates, they get their names in the news, and then people tune in to see, what fresh controversy might I hear on my way to work? Are they going to drive someone to their death by haranguing them on the radio or whatever? And advertisers love that, but they don't want their product associated with anything too distasteful. So, it's this kind of fine line where they're like, be edgy. That's what we want you to do, but don't go over the line, because then, the regulator gets involved, then public criticism starts to ramp up, and then the advertisers run for the hills, which seems to be, of course, what's happening now with the former Kyle and Jackie O show.
When you told me about this story this week, my initial thought was, well, this is obviously just a stunt, because that's what commercial FM radio, particularly breakfast radio, is. I've spent a little bit of time in Adelaide commercial FM radio studios, just observing just observing behind the scenes, also being aware of what happens on air, and just how the whole thing is a confection. It's this I found them these very uncomfortable spaces where people who get elevated to those roles are typically people who think that their own lives are extremely interesting, and they will kind of mine nuggets of truth in their own lives and then create these kind of on-air personas that reference the little nuggets of truth that have happened in their own lives, and then just through exaggeration and hyperbole create this sort of faux reality that exists on air that they then themselves sort of buy into, because it's not like people are having conversations in those rooms where they go, oh yeah, this is all just made up. Obviously that story that I'm telling kind of happened, but then I added all of this, or obviously that prank that we pretended was real, everybody was in on. They don't say that. They all just kind of, you're sort of invited into this world where you have to just sign on to the fact that you go, we all think that we're all amazing, and then oh, my dad's called in. You're like, Barry, why are you calling in again, Dad? You're an absolute bloody liability. Oh, g'day, Graham. Oh, you lot are always bloody. Oh, I had you over for dinner last night, and you're an absolute mess. You had too many beers. Oh, no, I didn't, Dad. Oh, I'm gonna hang up on Dad now. Dad's always calling in. And, that is his dad, but he's just texts his dad and says, call in. And I just found the whole thing
call in and
so
tell everyone I
gross.
had a few beers or whatever. Yeah, that's very true. This kind of idea of not outright fabrication, but just taking a pretty sort of bread and butter story that's got no real, anecdotal value and embellishing it to the point where it's this huge thing. And even then, a lot of the stuff they talk about is just fucking boring. I just, it's just, they're just scraping the barrel some days. And I guess that's why that's part of what this spat was about, was this kind of idea that the mask had slipped a bit. Jackie just was sort of phoning it in. They were talking about Prince Andrew, and she was just so bored. She was like, what does his star chart say?
I just loved the idea that I was like, how can you tell that what's the difference? How can you tell that she's phoning it in? What the fuck's the I'd have no idea what the difference is between a phoned in Jackie and a real
It's
Jackie.
True. It's true.
No, I better check his horoscope. I better check his horoscope. And Carl's like, oh, you've absolutely dropped the ball here. This show used to be the high watermark.
Exactly.
Of radio.
I came into this because I'd watched the Frost Nixon interview and I cared about the truth, and now look at us.
So maybe so what happened was, I saw John is that she came in And he said something about Prince Andrew and the Epstein scandal, and she said, "Let me check the horoscope." And he's like, "Oh no, like horoscopes are so beneath us," or something, something insane. It's just, "Oh, you're phoning it in," and then she goes, "No, I actually am upset this time," even though, again, like their whole thing has always been just creating these faux controversies. So then the Daily Mail will, and in fact, of course, after the show, they'll write to the Daily Mail and go, "Oh, if you didn't catch the show, here's a clip. We got upset with each other." But for whatever reason, this does appear to be somewhat real, and now and insiders are also suggesting that it maybe has more to do, and there may be slightly more to it, and potentially the radio station is rubbing its hands together because they want out of the contract, because they tried to syndicate the show to Melbourne. It didn't work. They were hoping to syndicate it.
They were on the hook for all this money.
The reason they paid them so much money is because the idea was that they could take this Sydney-specific breakfast show and just literally stream the same show to Melbourne and then Brisbane, and obviously get all of those advertising bucks as well. And Melbourne, as you say, was like, "Nah, this is dreadful. We don't fucking know these people. We haven't been listening to this trash for fucking 20 years."
Exactly. And what little we know about them just makes us want to throw up, because they'd have a kind of presence a little bit outside of radio where they would go on, they'd just sort of do the circuit of like Australian Idol or Big Brother Australia or whatever. And that, because they were those kinds of people. And particularly Kyle was kind of known as being, a brash enfant terrible who would sort of come on and tell you what he thought about things in a slightly offensive way. And so we kind of knew about them in Melbourne, but then obviously, and the previous radio team from KIIS who were here were your pretty standard people, like someone who'd probably been on Neighbours, someone who was an Australian rules football player. And they were kind of just doing pretty boring stuff like, what's your favourite sandwich, Barry? Oh, anyone else call in and tell us what's the food that everyone likes that you don't like, or whatever. And then they were kind of, and that's what, people didn't really want, I don't think, in Melbourne to be particularly challenged by sort of gross out segments or edgy stunts or anything that their kids couldn't listen to or whatever.
Yeah.
So it hasn't worked. And I think now they are kind of saying, and, who knows, maybe someone, I wouldn't put it past any of these people, like maybe someone got in Kyle's ear, just said, can you just kick off at her about nothing? And then she, or whatever, or said to her, like when she took time off, said to her, maybe actually you should think about whether you do want to come back or whatever.
Yeah. Or Machiavellian.
Exactly. The producer gets on the phone with her and says, "So I guess you've quit. Yeah, you've quit. Okay, thanks. Great." Just has his lawyers on speakerphone or whatever. So now there's a massive gap in the market, I guess, and I don't know what's going to happen to either of them, but more importantly to the commercial radio landscape. I don't really know anyone else who has a sort of similar profile in Australia, as I said, because you've got this kind of, over the years just becomes more and more concentrated on the number one people, and they've spent 25 years building their profile. Yeah. So it is kind of a strange moment. The other thing, I guess, is you mentioned, that you thought this was just another fake fight. I had a bit of a look back at some of the controversies on the show, and I mean, Kyle Sandilands has a great Wikipedia page for anyone who's interested in the kind of person they're dealing with, where he's just sort of, like he's one week he's like fat shaming someone with cancer or he fucking running over someone in his car. Mate, he was, So here's just the headlines. And that, I mean, the headlines are kind of a delight in themselves. Controversies, lie detector incident and sacking from Network 10. So that was in 2009. He put and I don't know why they thought this was a good idea. They put a teenage girl on a lie detector test and asked, she was 14 or something, and asked her about her sexual experiences in front of her mum.
Man.
And she revealed that she had been sexually assaulted. Yeah. And it was just like this kind of like, what were you fucking idiots thinking? Like, this was the worst. I mean, even if she hadn't revealed that, it was just kind of a disgusting idea. Anyway, then we move on to later in 2009, concentration camp comments. That's always a great thing to have on your CV, where he's insulting a beloved comedian and actress in Australia, Magda Szubanski, about her weight and saying that she would lose more weight in a concentration camp. Then he's making comments about a child with a disability and using words that I haven't used since primary school to describe people with disabilities. Then Virgin Mary comments, another great classic, so offending Christians in 2019. And then insulting people with monkeypox, which was kind of known to be a disease that was affecting the gay community in particular. Then we've just got a couple of classic standards, fat-phobic comments, and then misogynistic comments. So I don't need to go into all of those. But that's the kind of tenor of the history of it. And every time that happens, you know, the regulator will kind of shake its fists and say, you know, you can't do that. We're issuing an infringement or whatever. They might even get him to pay a fine. But of course, like as long as they're not shutting the show down, which I'm not even sure they could do, then, you know, KIIS FM says, well, this is just the cost of doing business. It's a little bit of free advertising for us. That the regulator's putting out a press release, which is great for us. And if they want, you know, $20,000 to do that, that's peanuts. So on and on it goes. And so, like, I think by the time they came to Melbourne, part of the response was like, how is this idiot still on the radio? Because he's just, every time I hear about him, he's just saying awful things. So it hasn't worked. And yeah, now I guess he's just got to go and be awful in his Sydney Harbour mansion on his own.
I can imagine, it's funny, I can imagine that Jackie would work as an independent podcast host. For whatever reason, I don't sense that with him because I feel like his personality, I feel like his personality is so dated FM radio shock jock thing.
Yeah,
it's funny, interesting what you mentioned before, John. This doesn't really exist in the UK. It exists in the US, and you can instantly think of American like the zoo team.
Exactly.
Okay, guys, what are we doing this morning? Yeah. And there's all sound effects. And
the guys who were in the skit that spawned the phrase "Don't praise the machine."
That's right. Mentioned,
KBBL.
Exactly. KBBL.
Looks like those clowns in Washington did it again.
What a bunch of clowns. Wow, how do they keep up with the news like that? That's right. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, so much of our show references FM radio culture because we grew up with it. But yeah, I can see her easily transitioning into her own. Okay, so she's going to do a kind of like, I mean, she's already doing the horoscope thing. She could do a kind of like, it's going to be a very female focused. Look, I used to be on FM radio. I was a huge commercial star, and now I'm doing a sort of softer show with and I, you know, it's being filmed and put on YouTube, and there's soft white couches, and I get other women to kind of call her daddy-esque. I mean, this is the thing.
Totally.
Call her daddy has a bit of that kind of, it's a bit risque. So she could bring a little bit of that, but also she's going to light incense and talk, and she's going to, you know, spruik products from Gwyneth Paltrow.
Vaginal cleansers,
Yeah, whereas I don't know. I just think Kyle's whole thing is he has to be passive.
Yeah.
You have to take him passively, because I just don't think people are going to go and actively download a podcast with Kyle that's just Kyle and no one else.
And he needs a foil. Like, he needs someone to be kind of shocked and say, you know, Kyle, do you really think that's appropriate? And he's saying, yeah, well, they are, aren't they? Those Sheilas are fat. You know, it's just him saying that in a room. People are going to go like, this guy's not really funny anymore. He's just it's just a mean man.
They're going to go, wait, they recorded this and had time to edit it, and they put that. I guess that's the other thing, isn't it, with these FM shows, is there's this sense that, the reason it's so, I accept that it's off the wall and zany because it's live. Whereas if he was to do a podcast and he was doing the same shit, you'd just be like, well, you had hours hours to decide whether or not that was going to come out or not.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the pre-recording of the show would completely change the tone of it because nothing that he's actually saying is like, he's not the kind of guy whose opinions about things are interesting. He's just kind of someone who speaks his mind and is good at kind of being unfiltered, I guess, or perhaps bad at being filtered, but responds spontaneously to things and is kind of has a nose for walking up to the line in terms of, saying things that are going to ruffle people's feathers, obviously. But I do wonder, I mean, yeah, he's also the classic sort of tragicomic figure, that you sort of touched on it earlier, this trope of people who are kind of really high energy and zany on the air, but you get the sense that they are just a sort of deep spring of sadness off the air. And he sort of does seem like that. Like he's got, I remember him on Enough Rope, a talk show from back in the day with Andrew Denton, where he was talking about how his parents divorced when he was a kid and he was really cut up about it and whatever. And you can just imagine him being the kind of kid at school who was, attention seeking because he just wanted to be loved and whatever. So there's that kind of energy that, again, if it's just him alone, it starts to seem pretty sad and you're not going to enjoy it.
I mean, but it's funny as you say this. I could picture him doing a sort of like, look, that was my on-air FM radio commercial persona, but I'm going to do a sort of soft podcast now where I'm going to get back in touch with I'm going to heal. It's Kyle Sandilands Healing My Inner Child and Soothing podcast.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. No, I could definitely do that. Or maybe they could do Kyle and Jackie O with a kind of with a sort of soft mediator talking about their feelings and how they got to this point. Another interesting phenomenon is this kind of, because there is this commercial landscape that doesn't exist, say, in the UK. So you do get people migrating. So there was a guy, Christian O'Connell, who is from the UK, who's now on Gold 104.3 in Melbourne, who's got kind of a reasonable history of being a DJ on radio in the UK. So he was on XFM London, he's on Virgin Radio, Absolute Radio, etc. But he's come to Australia, and I guess it's because, if you're not the kind of high-ranking BBC presenter in the UK, you're just not seeing that kind of money. Whereas he might be, if he's on, Gold 104.3 is a sort of reasonable, to be in the top 5 FM radio stations in Melbourne. So he might be on a decent wicket. So I guess, there might be, maybe there'll be a bit of a power struggle now. There'll be people kind of seeing the fall of Kyle and Jackie O and saying, well, it's a market for new up and comers to try and, achieve market dominance that they've lost. But we'll see. Look, if anyone wants to hit us up, I'd be happy to sort of turn up the obnoxious levels on my presentation style, if that's what it takes. I don't know what I wouldn't do for $10 million a year for 10 years.
It's funny, the power, it'll be very interesting to watch the power vacuum, what happens to the show that they have potentially will no longer be doing. Does it just end up as Kyle, and does he just get a sort of fill in for Jackie? Does that work with advertisers, or do they go away and they're replaced by carbon copies of themselves who are trying to do the exact same thing, and that works or doesn't work? Or do they get some young blood in who are of a different generation and have a little bit more empathy and a little bit more self-awareness than them? But is that what 30 to 55-year-olds on the commute want? And also, just how long does this commercial FM radio thing last? Obviously, there's still enough money. Advertisers think there's still enough money in that level of attention and that level of exposure that their brands are getting to a cashed up audience, that for the time being that still seems to be the case, but how long does that last until more and more? And I mean, the unique one of the unique things about radio is that compared to podcasts, a lot of people say, oh, so much of the attention is now going to social media or to, if you're talking about FM radio or radio generally, and you're looking at, okay, where is this type of listener going now if they're not going to be listening to this? And of course, people say, oh, it's podcasts, but podcasts are not live, and they're an active form of listening. So you have to. They're not just on in the grocery store. They're not just on in the car. They're not. You're not just hearing them as you pass a work site. You're not hearing them in the background of your office. So, that's the thing about radio, is that it is this passive thing that's that's everywhere, and podcasts can't replace that. But who knows? Maybe people just eventually go, I don't really need as much passive listening because it was pretty shit anyway. So I am actually going to actively decide what I want to listen to. But it'd be very interesting to see how long it goes.
And thought about my life this morning, and it was beautiful. Because I wasn't listening to Kyle put a flaming bag of dog shit on someone's doorstep or whatever. But yeah, it's true. I mean, it will be interesting, and that kind of like we've talked about it in reverse as sort of Twitch streamers who have or Kick streamers who have these sort of rolling 8-hour broadcasts effectively that sort of mirror the background of an FM or AM radio show.
And mirror the appeal with the controversy.
Yeah, exactly.
And the people being dicks. You're just like, Clavicula's a dick. That's why I tune in. It's like Sandilands.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And they have to keep upping the ante and, sort of saying, it's always this flirting with this idea, like, have I gone too far this time or whatever? And that's what keeps people tuning in, as well as that sort of, here's a kind of personality doing stuff in the background. I can be, tuned into that, and then I can do a bit of work, or I can, manage this tricky bit of traffic, and then I can tune back in, and I won't have to hit the back button because I've missed 45 seconds of, Dominic Sandbrook talking to me about the Congo Free State or something. Like podcasts are a little bit more cognitively demanding than Kyle and Jackie O. But I guess the other thing is, I mean, the podcasts, some podcasts are obviously trying to get to sort of occupy that space or have that energy in a way that the original format,
particularly in Australia, John, I've seen, I forget the name of it, but I sometimes look at the Australian podcast charts, and a lot of the shows that do really well, they kind of look very much like a slightly less controversial FM radio show.
They do, yeah. I mean, even the way they marketed, the sort of visual look of the two hosts kind of, japing about with each other. It's very much like what you would see on a billboard for
Ballsy and Twiggo back
Exactly. Yeah. They all have that. I've joked on this podcast about this before, but they all have a sort of similar cadence. It's like Fifi, Fev, and Nick in the morning. So
everybody gets a stupid nickname, which I loved reading through some of the news articles about Kyle and Jackie O's split, because I had to talk to all of these like FM radio managers and other personalities and get their opinion, and everybody was like Graham Fatty Newton and Lisa Speedy Speed and shit like this.
Yeah, it's so true. It's like some weird version of the WWF. Very strange. And Al, I hope that you revisit your halcyon days of commercial radio interning at some point, because that would make a lovely little ongoing kind of side topic on the show. We could have the latest stories of you being bullied by a sociopath at a commercial radio station.
That's one of the greatest anecdotes that I still have to work out how to tell on the show without getting in both legal trouble or potentially giving the person who it involves yet another troublesome mental health.
I deliberately steered away from that particular controversy, even though it's one of the most well-known.
It's my best anecdote to anybody who knows me personally. If I always tell everybody, I said, I'm about to tell you, this is the number one anecdote that I've been boiling down like a stand-up comedian getting his greatest joke honed through weeks and years of trimming the fat off. And every time I deliver the punchline of that anecdote, the reveal, people go, oh, no way, I remember. So maybe we'll make it a little Patreon special. And that's a great segue, John. If you want to hear some of the most secretest, bestest anecdotes from us that we can't reveal on the podcast because of regulators that just won't let us say the things that we want to say. If you want to support the podcast, the best way to do it, patreon.com/DPTM, or just search Patreon. Don't Praise the Machine. Episodes, you get them a day early and you get a bonus once a month. Members episode, which we're about to record after this one. Maybe people have noticed that my background has been different the last 3 shows. And you got to pop over to Patreon if you want to find out why that is, because it'd be very difficult to work out otherwise exactly where I've been. Yeah. John, I've loved that episode so much. And I can't wait to see what happens with Kyle and Jackie O, the FM radio space, the podcast space, and where the attention goes as we move forward in this cultural apocalypse.
Maybe we'll get them on the show. Maybe their stars will decline to the point where we'll be able to get them on the show.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, everybody, and we can't wait to see you next week.
The podcast.